I'll never forget the moment I heard those words. "Mom, there's a man pointing a gun at me." Her voice was eerily calm, too calm, like she was reading off a grocery list instead of describing something terrifying. She followed up with, "Don't worry, I'll handle it, but you might want to come home now before this guy becomes the evening news." I dropped everything, literally left my colleagues mid-conversation in a conference room, and raced home. Just 2 weeks earlier, we'd moved into this neighborhood. Who would have thought that the Homeowners Association would greet my daughter with the barrel of a gun? They had no idea who they were dealing with. Not just because she was an adult capable of handling herself, but because Jessica wasn't just anyone. If you're watching this from your own HOA nightmare, drop a comment below and tell me what ridiculous rule they've tried to enforce on you. Honestly, I never imagined I'd be in this kind of situation. After 20 years of marriage, a surprisingly amicable divorce, and finally purchasing my dream home in Oakwood Estates, I expected peace. That's what the brochure promised anyway, a peaceful, well-maintained community where neighbors become family. What it should have said was something more like a tyrannical micro-kingdom where your property isn't really yours and armed wannabe cops might threaten your loved ones. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up and explain how all of this started. My name is Sarah Mitchell. I'm 45, and I work as a consumer rights attorney in Chicago. After my divorce, I wanted a fresh start, somewhere safe, beautiful, and well-maintained. Oakwood Estates checked all the boxes. Colonial-style homes, perfectly manicured lawns, and friendly neighbors during the open house made me feel confident about the move. The realtor mentioned there was an active HOA, but honestly, I didn't think much of it. I'd lived under HOA rules before. How bad could it be? Much, much worse than I could have imagined. On my first official day as a homeowner, I was still unpacking when the doorbell rang. A nervous-looking woman in her early 50s stood there holding a thick binder. She introduced herself as Karen Wilson, the HOA secretary, and handed me the welcome package and rulebook. "Please review it as soon as possible to avoid any incidents," she said. The way she said incidents made it sound like breaking HOA rules might result in some sort of public flogging. I thanked her and took the binder, noticing how she glanced over her shoulder before hurrying back to her car. Strange behavior, but I chalked it up to social awkwardness. Later that evening, I flipped through the rulebook. My lawyer brain immediately spotted numerous legally questionable provisions. No parking on the street between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m., even for guests. No gatherings of more than 8 people without prior HOA approval. Mandatory attendance at quarterly HOA meetings. Fines starting at $50 for first offenses, doubling with each subsequent violation. And the most absurd one of all? The HOA board reserved the right to enter properties with 24-hour notice to inspect for compliance with regulations. That provision alone was legally unenforceable, a clear violation of property rights. I made mental notes to clarify these issues at the next HOA meeting, then set the binder aside and focused instead on making my new house feel like home. A week later, my daughter Jessica arrived for a 2-week visit during her vacation time. At 32, Jessica was my pride and joy, brilliant, level-headed, and accomplished. What few people knew, including our new neighbors, was that Jessica was an FBI tactical team commander with 10 years of experience in high-stress situations. She didn't advertise her profession, preferring to describe herself simply as a government employee when asked. I was thrilled to have her staying with me. Not only did I miss her terribly since she'd been stationed in the DC office, but I also wanted her advice on some home security upgrades I was considering. The morning after she arrived, we were enjoying coffee on the front porch when a small elderly woman approached from the house next door. "You must be Sarah's daughter," she said warmly, introducing herself as Linda Thompson, the neighborhood gossip, apparently, according to the HOA president. "Welcome to our little kingdom," she added with a chuckle. "Careful not to break any of the royal decrees, or you'll meet our self-appointed security chief, Doug. He thinks that badge he bought online makes him the sheriff of Oakwood County." Linda had a conspiratorial glint in her eye that immediately made me like her. She lowered her voice theatrically. "Watch out for Richard Connors, our HOA president. Former cop who retired early. Word is he was forced out after some scandal, but his buddies helped him avoid charges. Now he runs this place like his personal fiefdom. And Doug is his loyal enforcer." That afternoon, Jessica helped me unpack the last few boxes while I told her about the ridiculous HOA rules. "Sounds like someone with control issues," she observed, expertly arranging my book collection. "Small power and limited domains going to people's heads. Usually harmless, just annoying." How quickly we would discover just how wrong that assessment was. That evening, I parked my car, apparently 2 inches over the designated space line. The next morning, a bright orange notice was stuck under my windshield wiper. "Violation, improper parking. Fine, $50. Payable within 7 days to avoid additional penalty." "This is ridiculous," I said to Jessica, waving the orange notice over breakfast. "I'm not paying $50 for being 2 inches over an invisible line." Jessica examined the notice, her trained eye catching details I'd missed. "Mom, look at the signature. This wasn't issued by the HOA directly. It's signed by D. Peterson, Security Enforcement. Is that even an official position?" I was already typing an email to the HOA board citing specific state laws regarding reasonable enforcement of covenant restrictions. As an attorney, I couldn't let this slide, not just for myself, but on principle. Small abuses of power left unchecked always grow into larger ones. Less than 30 minutes after sending my email, my phone rang. A local number I didn't recognize. "Mrs. Mitchell?" "Richard Connors, Oakwood Estates HOA president." His voice was deep, with a forced politeness that didn't mask the underlying irritation. "I received your concerns about our parking enforcement. Perhaps as a newcomer, you don't understand how things work here. We maintain property values through strict adherence to our rules. Everyone follows them, no exceptions. I strongly suggest you pay the fine and adjust your attitude." Before I could respond with the legal precedents I'd already researched, he continued, his tone hardening. "Oakwood Estates might not be the right fit for people who can't follow simple rules. Things tend to get uncomfortable for troublemakers." The thinly veiled threat hung in the air for a moment before he added, "The next HOA meeting is tomorrow evening. Attendance is mandatory, 7 p.m. sharp at the community center." He hung up before I could say another word. That evening, Jessica and I were discussing strategies for the upcoming meeting when we heard a strange noise from the front yard. Jessica, always alert, was at the window in seconds. "Mom, you need to see this." I joined her just in time to watch a heavy-set man in what looked like a security uniform using red spray paint to draw a large X on our front lawn. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I called out, rushing to the front door. The man turned slowly, deliberately finishing his vandalism before facing me. "Official HOA warning, ma'am. This property has received multiple compliance notices." "Multiple?" "We'd received exactly one, just that morning." "This is your final warning before further action," he said, tapping the holster on his belt, not subtly, before walking away to a car parked across the street. I was furious, but Jessica's expression was calm, almost amused. "Did he just imply he might use a weapon over a parking violation?" she asked quietly, pulling out her phone to take photos of the lawn. "Mom, I think I'm going to stick around a bit longer than planned. This just got interesting." There was something in her tone that made me pause, not fear, but the calculated interest of someone who had just spotted a puzzle they were particularly qualified to solve. "I don't know what that red X means," I told her. "But I'm guessing we've just been marked as troublemakers." Jessica's small smile was unsettling in its confidence. "No, Mom. They've just marked themselves as the type of bullies who don't know when they're picking on the wrong person." The next evening, we arrived at the community center for the HOA meeting to find about 40 residents already seated in rows of folding chairs. Richard Connors, a tall man with silver hair and the rigid posture of someone who enjoys authority, stood at the front with Doug, the lawn vandal from yesterday, hovering nearby. I recognized Karen Wilson sitting behind a small table with meeting minutes and financial reports. She avoided eye contact when we walked in. People spoke in hushed tones, falling silent as Richard called the meeting to order. "Before we begin, let's welcome our newest resident, Sarah Mitchell," he announced. All eyes turned to me. Mrs. Mitchell has already demonstrated her special perspective on our community standards. A few nervous chuckles rippled through the room, but most faces remained impassive. For the next 45 minutes, I watched in horrified fascination as Richard and Doug ran the meeting like petty dictators. Residents who asked about increasing landscaping costs were quickly shut down with vague references to necessary improvements. When a man I would later learn was Michael Garcia questioned why security expenses had tripled in 6 months, Richard interrupted him. "We've discussed this before, Michael. Increased security is non-negotiable given recent regional incidents." No specifics were offered, and Michael wasn't allowed to follow up. I observed residents exchanging glances, but remaining silent. The atmosphere of intimidation was palpable. When the financial report concluded, I raised my hand. Richard pointedly looked elsewhere until no other hands remained. "Yes, Mrs. Mitchell," he finally acknowledged, not bothering to hide his annoyance. "I have several questions about the legal basis for some of your enforcement protocols," I began, my voice steady. "Particularly the provision allowing HOA representatives to enter private property for compliance inspections that directly contradicts state property laws unless specific consent is established in the original deed." A tense silence fell over the room. Additionally, I continued, "Your fine structure exceeds what's permissible under state statutes governing homeowners associations, specifically Code 27 to 45.3. Richard's face flushed, his knuckles whitening around the podium. "Mrs. Mitchell, we appreciate your legal opinions," he said coldly. "However, our covenant was established with guidance from top HOA attorneys. These matters were settled long before you arrived." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Perhaps in your next home, you'll do more thorough research before buying." The dismissive tone was meant to humiliate, and I felt heat rising in my cheeks, but years of courtroom experience had taught me to never show when an opponent had landed a blow. As the HOA meeting wrapped up, Karen Wilson slipped a folded note into my hand when I passed her table. She didn't say anything, just gave me a quick glance that said more than words ever could. Once outside, I unfolded the paper and read, "Careful. Cameras and microphones in common areas. They're watching." Before I could even process what that meant, Doug deliberately bumped into me as I walked toward my car. He didn't apologize. Instead, he muttered just loud enough for me to hear, "We know how to handle people like you. Ask the Johnsons why they sold so quickly last year." Then he turned and walked away to the same car we'd seen parked outside our house the night before. Back home, I found Jessica already deep in conversation with Linda Thompson and a man I didn't recognize. Her eyes were bright with excitement. "Mom," she said, "I think we found a small army to fight the neighborhood tyrant." She introduced me to Michael Garcia, the same man who had tried asking about security expenses at the meeting. "Michael has some very interesting security footage you need to see." Before she could explain further, my phone chimed with an email notification. The subject line made my stomach drop. "Serious violation, $5,000 fine." It came from Richard Connor's HOA email address. I opened it, reading aloud, "Unauthorized gathering." That was their claim, that having guests in my own home violated HOA rules. Michael nodded grimly. "They pulled the same thing on me last month when I hosted my brother's family. Called it an unregistered event exceeding occupancy guidelines." The real issue? I'd been asking questions about their financial reports. This is how they operate, find any excuse to pressure people who don't fall in line. Linda sipped her tea calmly, then added, "They've been doing this for years. Most people just pay the fines to avoid conflict." Those who fight back suddenly find themselves with broken windows caused by neighborhood kids or plumbing issues that mysteriously affect only their homes. She leaned forward. But the Mitchells aren't most people, are they? Jessica grinned, that determined look I hadn't seen since she took down a notorious fraud ring 3 years ago. Michael has been documenting Richard and Doug's activities for months. Show her, Michael. He opened his laptop and played a series of video clips from his home security system. There was footage of Richard and Doug accepting cash from a construction contractor working without permits. Clips of Doug placing violation notices only on homes of residents who had questioned the board. And most disturbing of all, Richard and another man examining houses while referencing a list, including mine. They've got a blacklist, Michael explained. Homes they want to target because the locations are prime for redevelopment once the new commercial zone is approved across the highway. Linda pulled out a small notebook from her purse. I'm a retired investigative journalist. Old habits die hard. I've been keeping records of every suspicious activity since Richard took over the HOA 3 years ago. 26 families have been forced out through harassment, selective enforcement, and in some cases, outright intimidation. The homes are always purchased by shell companies that trace back to Richard's brother-in-law's real estate firm. They're buying low from harassed homeowners and sitting on properties until the rezoning goes through. The pieces were falling into place. This wasn't petty power abuse, it was a calculated real estate scheme. So, they're not just neighborhood tyrants, I said, feeling that familiar fire ignite whenever I encountered systematic injustice. They're real estate predators. As a consumer rights attorney, I'd seen countless schemes to defraud ordinary people. But this one struck a deeper chord. It was happening in my own home, to my own neighbors. They'd found a way to weaponize the HOA structure to systematically force out targeted homeowners for profit. Jessica was studying Michael's footage with the intense focus I'd seen her apply to complex FBI cases. Her eyes narrowed as she spotted connections invisible to most people. Look at their pattern, she pointed out. They escalate gradually. First, minor violations with small fines, then increasingly absurd infractions with larger penalties, followed by maintenance issues that make life uncomfortable, and finally direct intimidation. She paused the footage on Richard's face, zooming in on his expression as he accepted cash from the contractor. That's not just greed, she observed quietly. That's the look of someone who enjoys the power. He's not just after money, he's getting psychological satisfaction from controlling people's lives. Linda nodded knowingly. That's exactly it. I've interviewed dozens of corrupt officials over my journalism career, and there's a certain type who's drawn to positions of petty authority precisely because they can inflict suffering with impunity. The HOA structure is perfect for them, minimal oversight, broad enforcement powers, and a captive audience who literally can't escape without selling their homes. Michael added, my security system captured something else last week, Richard telling Doug which houses to target next. He specifically mentioned yours, Sarah, saying you were going to be a problem. He already had plans to squeeze you out before you even challenged him at the meeting. The thought that I had been targeted from the beginning sent a chill down my spine, followed quickly by righteous anger. These bullies had no idea who they were dealing with, a seasoned attorney and an FBI tactical commander who specialized in taking down organized criminals. The next morning, I filed a formal complaint with the City Housing Authority about the HOA's practices. By afternoon, our water was shut off. Emergency maintenance on your section of the line, Doug announced when I confronted him, not even trying to hide his smirk. Should be back on in 6 hours or so. HOA regulations permit essential infrastructure maintenance at our discretion. Maybe keep a few bottles of water handy next time you decide to file complaints. Jessica watched this exchange from the porch, her expression neutral, but her eyes calculating. That evening, while I was on a conference call with colleagues, Jessica installed hidden security cameras around our property using equipment she'd borrowed from her FBI resources. Just standard precautions, she assured me. Nothing that would compromise any investigation. That night, we noticed Doug's car parked across the street, occasionally shining a flashlight toward our windows. Intimidation tactics, Jessica explained unfazed. They're trying to make us uncomfortable enough to either fall in line or move out. Classic bullying behavior, but legally ambiguous enough that if we called the regular police, they'd just say he's conducting neighborhood security. She was typing something on her phone as she spoke. Remember Karen, the nervous HOA secretary? She just texted me. Wants to meet tomorrow at Riverdale Coffee Shop. Says she can help. Jessica's smile was confident, almost predatory. Mom, I think we just got ourselves an inside man in the enemy castle. I couldn't sleep that night, my mind racing with both concern and determination. Through my bedroom window, I could still see the faint outline of Doug's car and the occasional beam of his flashlight sweeping across our front lawn. The red X he had painted still marred our grass, a scarlet badge of defiance that was now becoming a symbol of our resistance. I thought of all the families who had been driven from their homes, who had surrendered to Richard's tactics simply because they lacked the resources or knowledge to fight back. 26 families, Linda had said, 26 households bullied and threatened until they gave up their homes at deflated prices, all to satisfy one man's greed and power complex. As I finally drifted toward sleep, I found myself smiling despite the situation. Richard Connors had spent years perfecting his system of intimidation and exploitation, targeting those he perceived as vulnerable or isolated. But in choosing my home, he had made a critical miscalculation. He had no idea that his usual tactics of intimidation would fall flat against a woman who had stared down corporate giants in courtrooms, or that his amateur security enforcer was currently parked outside the home of an FBI tactical commander who had faced down actual terrorists. In his arrogance, Richard had finally picked the wrong targets. Tomorrow, with Karen's help, we would begin turning the tables. The game was indeed on, but Richard was about to discover he was no longer the only one making the rules. The next morning, I found my car vandalized with fresh spray paint across the driver's side door, comply or leave. It was crude, but the message was clear, they wanted us out. Jessica and I documented everything meticulously. Every violation notice, every act of intimidation, every suspicious interaction had been saved as part of our growing evidence file. That same day, Jessica got a call back from her FBI colleague, Agent Thomas Davis, who had run background checks on both Richard Connors and Doug Peterson. The results were even more damning than we expected. Richard had been forced to resign from the police force after multiple complaints of excessive force and an internal affairs investigation into evidence tampering. Charges were mysteriously dropped under what Thomas described as suspicious circumstances. As for Doug, he had no legitimate security credentials. His concealed carry permit had been revoked 3 years earlier after he brandished his weapon at a supermarket customer. And perhaps most disturbingly, there was already an ongoing federal investigation into money laundering through several HOAs in the county, Oakwood Estates included. Jessica had barely ended the call when she received a frantic text from Michael, "Emergency. Doug is at my door. He has a gun." Without hesitation, she grabbed her keys. "Stay here," she told me. "Call the local police, but make sure you tell them this is a potential armed standoff so they respond appropriately. I'm going over there." Before I could argue, she was out the door, moving with that focused efficiency I'd only seen when she was fully in FBI mode. I paced the living room, jumping at every sound, praying her training would keep her safe. When the dispatcher assured me officers were on their way, but mentioned they were short-staffed due to a multi-car accident on the highway, my stomach dropped. 15 minutes until backup arrived. 15 minutes felt like forever when someone had a gun pointed at people I loved. After what felt like hours, but was actually only 6, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my keys and drove down to Michael's house. As I approached, I saw Doug standing on Michael's porch, hand resting heavily on his holstered gun, gesturing aggressively toward the security cameras. Jessica was already there, positioned between Doug and Michael, her posture relaxed, but her eyes razor-sharp. I stayed back, not wanting to escalate anything, but close enough to hear Doug's angry demands. Those cameras are a violation of HOA privacy standards. They're recording common areas without authorization. Take them down now or face fines of $100 per day plus removal costs. Michael stood firm in his doorway. The cameras are on my property, recording my property. That's completely legal under state law. There are no HOA regulations that can override that. Doug's face turned red with frustration. I'm not asking again. The HOA has determined these cameras violate Section 12 of the Covenant regarding surveillance of common areas. Jessica stepped in then, calm but authoritative. Sir, I've reviewed the Oakwood Estates Covenant thoroughly. Section 12 addresses landscape maintenance schedules, not security systems. There is no provision restricting homeowners from installing security cameras on their own property. Her precise knowledge clearly threw Doug off balance. Who the hell are you? This doesn't concern you. I'm Jessica Mitchell, a family friend staying with the Mitchells, she replied coolly. And actually, this does concern me, since you appear to be threatening a homeowner without legal authority. Doug, clearly frustrated by Jessica's calm interference, reached for his holster and pulled his gun. He waved it between Jessica and Michael. You people don't understand how things work around here. When security says take down the cameras, you take them down. Instead of showing fear, Jessica looked at the gun with something close to clinical curiosity. Only amateurs hold a gun like that, she said casually. Finger already on the trigger. That's interesting. Her critique seemed to infuriate him further. You think this is a joke? I'll show you how serious I am. He raised the gun toward the sky and fired a single shot, likely meant to intimidate. What happened next was so fast I could barely follow it. In one fluid motion, Jessica stepped forward, struck Doug's wrist with precision, and gripped his elbow. The gun clattered to the ground as she continued the movement, twisting his arm behind his back and taking him down to the ground with professional efficiency. Doug's face registered pure shock as he found himself immobilized face down on the porch, Jessica's knee pressing firmly against his back while she secured his wrists. Michael, she said calmly, could you pick up the weapon carefully by the grip, using your shirt to avoid disturbing fingerprints? Michael complied, his expression a mix of awe and disbelief. And Mrs. Mitchell, she added, nodding toward me where I stood frozen at the edge of the lawn. Perfect timing. Could you please inform the responding officers that we have an armed suspect detained? Just moments later, the police arrived, taking in the scene with professional caution. Jessica identified herself as FBI, flashing credentials I hadn't even realized she was carrying. The officers' demeanor shifted immediately, becoming noticeably more respectful as they took custody of Doug and secured the weapon. This man discharged a firearm in a residential area while threatening civilians, Jessica explained. The weapon appears to be carried without a valid permit based on information we've received from federal sources. She gave a concise, law enforcement-style report of what she had witnessed, and the officers seemed grateful for her clarity. As Doug was being placed in the patrol car, Richard Connors came screeching to a halt at the curb, rushing toward the scene. What's going on here? He demanded. Doug works for me for the HOA. Whatever happened must be a misunderstanding. The lead officer blocked his approach. Sir, step back. This man discharged a firearm during a threatening confrontation and is being arrested for multiple weapons violations and assault charges. Richard's face twisted in rage and disbelief. This is ridiculous. You can't arrest our security officer for doing his job. Who made these accusations? His eyes landed on me, then Jessica, then Michael. I'll have your badges for this harassment. The officer remained unimpressed. Sir, unless you want to join him for interfering with an arrest, I suggest you step back now. As Richard watched helplessly while Doug was driven away, he brushed past Jessica with a low, venomous whisper. You've made a serious mistake. You have no idea who we are or what we can do. Jessica smiled calmly. Funny. That's exactly what I was about to say to you. But Richard wasn't done. The next morning, our mailbox was stuffed with 17 new violation notices. Everything from unapproved landscaping modifications, including the red X Doug himself had painted, to unauthorized security equipment, our cameras, was listed. Each carried a minimum fine of $100. That night, someone destroyed the flowers in our front garden, pulling plants from the soil and leaving them scattered across the lawn. Security footage showed two teenagers doing the damage, but their faces were covered, and they avoided camera angles carefully. The message was clear. Richard had other resources besides Doug, and he wasn't backing down. Meanwhile, Agent Thomas called Jessica with some promising news. The FBI's Financial Crimes Unit had accelerated its investigation into the Oakwood Estates HOA based on the evidence we provided. We've been building a case against several coordinated HOA fraud schemes in the region, he explained. Richard Connor's operation appears to be one node in a larger network. The physical intimidation and weapons charges add significant weight to what was previously just a financial investigation. Karen continued feeding us inside information, delivering copies of financial records that revealed nearly $500,000 had been diverted from HOA funds through fake service contracts to companies owned by Richard's relatives. On my end, I organized a meeting of concerned homeowners at a restaurant outside the neighborhood to avoid HOA surveillance. 23 residents attended, many sharing similar stories of harassment, selective enforcement, and mysterious property damage after questioning Richard's leadership. Together, we formed the Fair Homeowners Alliance and drafted a petition demanding a special election to replace the current board. Karen, still maintaining her cover as Richard's loyal secretary, let us know that Richard was furious about the growing opposition. He scheduled an emergency HOA meeting, placing membership termination procedures prominently on the agenda, a thinly veiled threat to try and have me expelled from the community.